Welcome back to the radio. Tonight, the year is 2098, and you are standing at the edge of a ruined city where crumbling towers lean just enough to make you keep checking the sky, and the streets are so quiet you can hear your own footsteps bouncing back from walls half swallowed by vines. The air carries a faint metallic scent, as if it still remembers the machines that once hummed here. Your pack is light, your hands are steady, and you've learned not to expect much, except maybe the occasional feral pigeon who clearly thinks you are trespassing. One stares at you now like it's about to demand rent. By the way, what time is it where you are? And where in the world are you listening from tonight? Leave a note in the comments, and if you haven't yet, consider subscribing to Quilloren Radio so you don't miss the next story. Without further ado, let's begin. You step forward into the shell of what was once a main street. The asphalt is fractured into long, uneven plates, as if the earth beneath it had slowly shifted to shrug off the weight of the past century. Your boots scuff against gravel that wasn't here originally. It is the slow crumble of everything that once stood straight. The morning air is cool and damp, carrying the faint tang of oxidized metal and the ghost of rain from the night before. The light doesn't come from above so much as it seeps in from all directions, filtering through hollow windows and gaps in walls where doors once were. A metal sign swings lightly in the wind somewhere up ahead, its hinges loose enough to voice their complaint every few seconds. Each creak echoes strangely, the sound traveling down empty hallways and abandoned stairwells before dissolving into the soft, constant whisper of air moving through open spaces. You find your pace slowing, not because anything blocks your path, but because there's something about the quiet here that encourages it, the kind of stillness that demands you notice it. The sidewalk is mostly intact in patches, but at odd intervals, entire sections are missing. Nature has filled the absences with weeds that have grown thick and fibrous, their stalks leaning toward any crack that might carry more light. As you step around them, your hand brushes against the rough wall of a building, and flakes of old paint come away like dry leaves. There's no trace of what color it used to be. Up ahead, a storefront has lost most of its glass, and inside, the counters are still in place. You can tell they've been scavenged before. Nothing valuable remains, only the outlines of where things once sat. The dust on the counter is thick enough to keep its own record. You see the shapes of footprints, perhaps weeks old, leading toward a back door that now hangs open at an angle. You don't follow them. Instead, you linger in the doorway, letting the air inside reach you. It's warmer there, heavier somehow, as though the space has been holding on to its breath for decades. A soft scratching draws your eyes down to the floor, where a small rodent pauses mid-step to assess whether you're worth the trouble of avoiding. It decides you are, but only barely, and scurries through a gap in the wall. You take this as a polite acknowledgement of your presence, not quite a greeting, but certainly not a warning. The street bends slightly to the left, and you follow it, noticing how the buildings here lean toward each other, their upper floors almost touching like they're conspiring. A lamppost in the center of the bend has fallen halfway, its base uprooted, but it leans against a balcony railing as if someone placed it there deliberately. You pause long enough to note the way rust has spread over it in small blooms, like an artist's brush that ran out of paint halfway through. Somewhere nearby, a loose sheet of metal rattles faintly. You glance up toward the sound and spot it near the roofline of a narrow brick structure. Each gust of wind nudges it into movement, and the sound shifts from a soft knock to a metallic sigh. It feels like the building is trying to communicate, though the language has long since eroded. As you continue, the texture of the ground changes again. Here, broken tile mosaics peek through the soil, their patterns too incomplete to decode. You stop to crouch and run your fingertips over the cool, glazed surface, the edges smoothed by time and weather. For a moment, the chill in the ceramic travels through your hand and up your arm, and you become aware of how quiet the city has become in the last few minutes. Even the swinging sign has stilled. You glance to your right and see a staircase leading down into what might have been a subway entrance or a basement shop. Half of it is underwater now, reflecting the ceiling above in a still, perfect mirror. The water smells faintly of rust and stone. You lean against the railing, its metal warm from the filtered light, and look down at your own reflection. The ripples that form when you shift slightly are the only movement for several seconds. Past the staircase, the path narrows between two buildings, forcing you to walk single file, even though you're alone. The brick walls here are closer than arm's length, and their surfaces are covered in climbing plants with leaves the size of your hand. A few of the leaves brush your shoulders as you pass, their surfaces cool and slightly waxy. You notice the faint sound of water dripping somewhere nearby, not constant, but steady enough to keep count of time if you wanted. The narrow path opens suddenly into a wide courtyard. Here, the ground is mostly stone, cracked in irregular shapes, with grass growing in the seams. A tree has rooted itself at the center, its branches reaching in all directions, unbothered by the lack of symmetry. On one branch, a plastic bag has been caught for so long that it's begun to shred into fine ribbons, fluttering in slow motion when the breeze picks up. You stand still in the middle of the courtyard for a long moment, letting the details settle around you. Somewhere in the upper floors, a window pane shifts slightly in its frame, producing a low, intermittent knock. You can hear your own breathing, the faint thud of your heartbeat, and the small rustle of your pack as it settles against your shoulder. The air feels balanced here, neither warm nor cold, and you think, for no particular reason, that if someone were to ask what year it was, you wouldn't be entirely sure you could answer without looking it up. At the far end of the courtyard, an archway leads deeper into the district. You start toward it, feeling the ground subtly change under your boots again. Somewhere to your left, tucked between two collapsed walls, you spot an object that catches the light in a way nothing else here does. You don't pick it up yet. There's no rush. Everything here has been waiting a long time already. The light shifts as you step beneath the archway, the brightness of the courtyard replaced by a cooler shade that smells faintly of rain-soaked concrete. The ground here is smoother, a stretch of old pavement shielded from the worst of the weather. A faint scent rises from it, the mingling of rust, damp air, and something faintly sweet, like dried leaves that have been sitting in a jar for years. It's that scent, more than anything, that makes you stop mid-step. You've smelled it before. For a moment, the ruins around you loosen their hold, and the memory comes quietly, without force. You're back in a kitchen from a life that doesn't fit the world as it is now. The walls are painted a warm yellow, chipped near the corners where chairs were pushed too far back. Morning light slides across the linoleum floor, catching the steam from a kettle on the stove. You can hear a faint radio somewhere in the background, not this one, but an old tabletop model that never quite tuned perfectly, the static blending with the voice of someone reading headlines that no longer matter. You're seated at the table, a chipped mug between your hands, steam curling from it in slow spirals. The air has that same sweet damp scent, coming from a bowl of apples set near the window. Outside, it's drizzling lightly, drops ticking against the glass. The sound is small but steady, filling the spaces between breaths. Somewhere in the next room, a chair creaks under someone's weight, followed by the soft thud of a newspaper being folded. The pace of that morning is unhurried. There's no list to complete, no pressing reason to leave the table. The floor is warm under your bare feet, a small detail you hadn't thought about in years, but it comes back as if you'd never left. The hum of the refrigerator is a low, constant presence, blending with the occasional rattle of the kettle lid as the water inside shifts. You can see your own hands on the table, younger, less worn. They're wrapped loosely around the mug, the heat settling into your skin. You lift it just enough to take a slow sip that tastes simple but grounding, not remarkable, not the best you've ever had, but enough to be worth remembering. Somewhere in your mind, you know that this memory isn't tied to any important event. It's just a morning. Just an ordinary, small corner of time that stayed intact when so much else shifted. From the kitchen window, you can see the street outside, cars parked in an orderly line, a thin mist softening their outlines. The neighbor's mailbox hangs slightly crooked on its post, a detail you never mentioned to anyone but always noticed. You remember thinking you'd fix it someday, but, of course, you never did. A faint sound from the present, the wind slipping through the archway, threads its way into the memory, but it doesn't break it. Instead, it blends, like the two places are layered over each other for a moment. The kitchen's yellow walls hover faintly behind the rough gray stone of the ruins. The steam from your mug curls upward into the same air that carries the metallic scent of the city outside. In the memory, someone moves past you, the faint brush of their sleeve catching your arm. They say something in a low, casual voice. You can't quite recall the words, only the tone. It's light, like the kind of comment meant to fill silence without disturbing it. You answer with something equally small, and they respond with a faint huff of laughter. The kettle clicks off. The drizzle outside lightens, drops slowing until they're too quiet to hear. You glance toward the clock on the wall, its hands moving with the steady patience of something that's been measuring time far longer than you've been watching it. The memory doesn't fade so much, as it unravels in thin strands, the details loosening until they fall away. The yellow walls pale to gray stone. The linoleum floor shifts back to cracked pavement under your boots. The hum of the refrigerator is replaced by the distant knock of loose metal somewhere above you. The scent of apples lingers faintly, even though you know there's nothing here to produce it. You stand in the shade of the archway a little longer, letting the sensation settle. There's a soft weight in your chest, not heavy enough to trouble you, but enough to remind you that you've carried this morning with you without even knowing. It's a quiet residue, the kind that shapes how you walk forward without announcing itself. The wind picks up again, brushing against the back of your neck. A strip of paper flutters along the ground ahead, catching briefly on a crack before lifting and spinning out of sight. The sound of it scraping over the pavement is small, almost polite, but enough to pull your focus fully back into the present. You adjust your pack and step forward. The cool shade gives way to pale light again, filtering through gaps in the buildings that lean over this street. Somewhere ahead, the path narrows into another passage. You can't see what's beyond it yet, but the air smells different there, less metallic, more open, with a faint trace of dust warmed by the sun. You follow it, feeling the memory settle quietly into the back of your mind, where it will stay until something else calls it forward again. The passage ahead narrows to the width of a hallway, framed by walls whose bricks have shifted just enough to suggest the buildings are no longer on speaking terms. The air here is still, with only the faint shuffle of grit under your boots breaking the quiet. As you step forward, a shape appears at the far end, a figure seated on a low wall, half in shadow. They notice you but don't stand, their posture relaxed, as if you're the third or fourth person they've seen this week, and they're still deciding if you're worth remembering. Their coat is a faded green, the sort of color that might have been chosen deliberately once, but has now been decided entirely by sun and time. Morning, they say, though it's hard to tell if they mean it in a literal sense, or just as a convenient placeholder for hello. You answer in kind, your voice carrying farther than expected in the confined space. They nod toward a pile of bent metal at their feet, scavenged wiring and a few rusted bolts, then glance at your empty hands. Not much left in this section, they remark, their tone neither encouraging nor discouraging. Unless you're collecting dust, in which case, you're in luck. The delivery is dry enough to make you pause, but there's no edge to it. You allow yourself a faint smile and tell them you'll keep the dust in mind. They return their attention to sorting through the scrap, the occasional clink of metal punctuating the quiet. After a moment, you step past, and they give a small, lazy wave without looking up, a gesture that feels less like goodbye and more like a bookmark placed in the day. A little farther on, the passage widens again into a stretch of street where weeds have grown in symmetrical rows, as though someone planned them that way. Off to the right, leaning in the doorway of a building with no roof, another scavenger watches you. This one wears a hat, with a brim so wide it hides most of their face, but you can see the curve of a faint grin. You just missed the group that came through, they say. 4 of them. Looked like they were after something shiny. You glance down at your boots, which are still dusted from the last block, and ask if they found anything. They found the sun, they answer, tilting their head toward a patch of light that has settled between the ruins like a puddle. Didn't seem satisfied. You nod, as though that's a perfectly complete report, and continue on. The faint humor in their voice lingers behind you like the smell of warm stone. At the next corner, a section of wall has collapsed into a slope of rubble. Perched on it is an older man with a pair of binoculars hanging from his neck, their lenses clouded from years of dust. He isn't using them, just holding them lightly while watching a pair of birds pick at something near the base of a tree. "You'll scare 'em off," he murmurs, though you're still several steps away. You slow your pace, and the birds seem unbothered. They hop from root to root, one occasionally pausing to inspect a leaf, as if it might be hiding an entire meal. "They've been here all morning," he adds. "Same too, far as I can tell. Probably arguing over whose turn it is to find lunch." There's no reason to respond, so you just stand for a moment, letting the breeze carry the faint rustle of leaves and feathers. When you eventually move on, he nods once in acknowledgement, not a farewell, just a quiet recognition that you've both witnessed the same small moment. The street curves toward an open plaza where the ground is cracked in neat geometric patterns. At its center, a lone table stands as if the rest of the furniture simply wandered off decades ago. Behind it, a woman is arranging small items on a cloth, bottle caps, fragments of ceramic, a handful of screws sorted by size. She glances up as you pass. "Trade?" she asks. You shake your head, and she shrugs, returning to her arrangement. "Sout yourself. But if you find a blue cap, bright blue, not the faded kind, I'll take it off your hands." There's a faint note of humor in her voice, as though she knows the odds are thin but enjoys saying it anyway. You promise you'll keep watch, even though neither of you believes the promise will be tested. At the far edge of the plaza, an alley pulls you in with the faint scent of warm stone and something green, plants growing between bricks in tight, stubborn clusters. A man sits on an overturned bucket halfway down, mending a strap with slow, precise movements. He doesn't look up, but When you pass, he says, "Careful past the bend." Ground's soft there. You thank him and take the advice, feeling the ground change under your boots, just as he said. It's the kind of detail that could only be learned by spending enough time here to notice. The alley opens back onto a street where light falls in wide, pale stripes through the gaps in the upper floors. You slow your pace again, not because there's anyone to talk to now, but because the air feels just as full as when there was. Each small exchange has left its trace, brief, unhurried connections that anchor the place as much as the stone and steel. You adjust your pack slightly, feeling the straps settle against your shoulders. Somewhere up ahead, a new stretch of the city waits, quieter still. The street ahead narrows to a strip of cracked concrete framed by low brick walls, their tops lined with weeds that sway in the light breeze. Each step makes a faint, hollow sound, as if the ground here hides empty space beneath it. You notice the smell of warmed dust, faint, but enough to pull at something in the back of your mind. It brings you to another life, one that doesn't match the quiet ruins surrounding you. Not a better life, not necessarily a worse one, just a different set of hours strung together. You remember working in a long, low building on the edge of a small town, its parking lot always half full even on slow days. The exterior was a washed-out beige, as if it had been painted once and then left to fade for the next 20 years. The air inside had the faint scent of paper, coffee, and the plastic tang of new packaging. Your job was simple: unpack boxes, check contents, and stack them neatly in the storeroom. The rhythm was slow and predictable, which suited you fine. There was a small radio on a shelf near the back, its casing yellowed with age, and you'd turn it just loud enough to hear while you worked. The music was often interrupted by a voice reading announcements about bake sales, lost pets, and the occasional weather warning that never quite matched what you saw out the window. You can still picture the storeroom, fluorescent lights humming overhead, concrete floor cold enough in winter to make your toes ache through your shoes. The shelves were arranged in long rows, each labeled in thick black marker. You had a habit of memorizing which items were where, not because it was required, but because it felt like a quiet skill no one else cared about. Occasionally you'd get shipments of something unfamiliar. You'd open a box, see an object you couldn't immediately name, and have to puzzle it out from the invoice sheet. Once, you spent 10 full minutes trying to figure out which way was up on a piece of shelving hardware, only to find the instructions tucked between 2 layers of cardboard. You'd laughed then, a short private laugh, and put the instructions back in the box just to see if the next person who opened one would have the same confusion. The break area was in a cramped corner behind a door that didn't quite close. 2 mismatched chairs, one slightly too low for the table, sat under a corkboard covered in faded notices. Someone had pinned up a cartoon months ago, and it had gone from mildly funny to oddly unsettling as it yellowed. The vending machine in the hallway rattled every time someone walked past, and the coffee machine dispensed liquid that tasted faintly like it had been brewed in a machine once used for cleaning engine parts. Still, you drank it, because it was hot and because everyone else did. Some mornings, you'd arrive early, the storeroom still cold, and stand there listening to the soft echo of your own footsteps while you switched on the lights. Those quiet minutes felt oddly private, as if the building itself hadn't quite woken up yet. You'd unwrap a pallet, slice through the plastic binding, and watch it curl away like something relieved to be released. The work never hurried you. You could stack boxes in your sleep, run your fingers over the smooth tape edges without looking. The days slipped by quietly, marked only by the movement of light through the small, high windows. Sometimes You'd pause mid-task to watch the dust drifting through the beams of sunlight, each mote spinning slowly before disappearing into shadow. You'd thought you might stay there for a long time. Not because you loved it, but because it didn't press against you. There was no great ambition in those rooms, no ladder you were expected to climb. It was the kind of job that didn't ask you to be more than you were on any given day. That felt like a rare thing, even then. Your mind drifts back further still, to the walk home after your shift. The sidewalk cracked in places, lined with narrow trees whose roots pushed the pavement upward. The air would cool in the evenings, carrying the scent of cut grass in summer and faint wood smoke in winter. You'd pass the same handful of houses, their porch lights coming on in slow succession as the sky dimmed. Sometimes you'd stop at the small grocery on the corner, buying just enough for one meal. The bell over the door would give a tired jingle, and the cashier would nod in greeting, their expression the same every time, as if perfectly preserved between your visits. You'd carry your bag home, feeling its weight shift against your leg with each step. Home was a second-floor apartment, with windows that rattled in the wind. In summer, the walls seemed to hold the day's heat well into the night. In winter, the floors stayed cold no matter how much you turned up the heater. You didn't own much: a bed, a table, a chair, and a bookshelf that leaned just slightly to the left. In the evenings, you'd eat while sitting by the window, watching the faint glow of distant streetlights. Sometimes you'd read, sometimes you'd just listen to the quiet. You never thought about those evenings much at the time. They were just the space between days. But here, in the stillness of the ruins, they feel like something solid, a stretch of life with edges you can still trace. You can almost hear the quiet scrape of your key in the old lock, the familiar resistance as you turned it. The memory doesn't arrive with longing. It settles gently, without nostalgia, like an object placed on a shelf where it belongs. You don't wish to return to it. You only acknowledge that it was part of the long path that led you here. The sound of the wind threading through a broken doorway brings you back to the present. You pause, letting the scent of warm dust fade until the sharper tang of rust returns. Ahead, the narrow street opens toward what looks like the remains of a public square, its center marked by a fountain that hasn't seen water in decades. A single bench, its metal frame warped, sits nearby as if still waiting for someone to rest there. You take a slow breath, feeling the air move in your chest, and start forward again. The square opens before you with a silence that feels practiced, as if it has been rehearsing this emptiness for years. The cracked stone tiles are bleached pale under the faded daylight, their edges softened by wind and time. Thin weeds sprout from the gaps, their green muted with dust. At the center, the fountain stands like a monument to waiting. Its basin is dry, but the stone is stained with the memory of water, dark lines tracing where it once spilled over. The carved figures that rise from the base, 3 children holding hands in a circle, have worn faces, features blurred into near anonymity. Only the suggestion of smiles remains, shallow grooves that the wind has not yet erased. You approach slowly, your boots scuffing against the tiles. The air here is still almost heavier than it was in the narrow street. The sound of your steps seems to fall short, absorbed before it can echo. Near the fountain's edge, you see a small object resting on the stone. At first it looks like a discarded piece of machinery, some fragment of the old world, left behind like so many others. But as you come closer, the shape resolves into something simpler. It's a child's shoe. It's small enough to fit in the palm of your hand, the leather cracked and stiff, the stitching frayed in places. The laces are gone, leaving only 2 small eyelets on each side. Dust has gathered in the hollow where a foot once rested, and a faint mark on the sole shows where it must have worn thin from walking. You pick it up carefully. The weight is barely there, but it feels heavier than it should. The air around you seems to pause. For a moment, you picture the shoe as it must have been, scuffed but whole, laces tied unevenly, perhaps kicked off in a hurry when the child ran barefoot into the grass on a warm day. You imagine it paired with another just like it, 2 halves of something ordinary and complete. Now, there is only one. You set it gently back on the stone, not because you fear breaking it, but because removing it feels like it would disturb something you can't quite name. Your gaze shifts to the bench across from the fountain. Its wooden slats are warped, splintered at the ends, but the metal frame still holds its shape. You walk toward it, brushing away a thin layer of dust before sitting down. The seat is uneven, leaning slightly to one side, but it offers a kind of stability nonetheless. From here, you can see the square in its entirety. 4 streets lead out from it, each lined with buildings that sag and tilt at different angles. The windows are empty, the doors half open or missing entirely. And yet, there's a faint order to the place. The fountain at the center, the bench, the open space, it feels deliberate, as if this was once a place where people gathered not out of necessity, but because they wanted to. You try to imagine it as it might have been. The fountain filled with clear water, the sound of it spilling over masking bits of conversation. Children running across the tiles, their footsteps sharp against the stone. Someone sitting on this very bench, leaning forward with their elbows on their knees, watching the square without needing to be anywhere else. The light shifts slightly, softening as a thin cloud passes overhead. You notice a faint ring of darker stone around the fountain's base, almost like a shadow, though it remains even after the cloud moves on. Perhaps it marks the boundary where water once splashed. Perhaps it's something else entirely. You reach into your satchel and take out the family photo. The edges are still curled from when you first found it, and the surface catches the light in uneven patches where the gloss has worn away. You hold it in your lap, the figures in the image looking out towards something you can't see. The bench beneath you creaks slightly as you shift your weight. The square is still silent, but it doesn't feel empty in the way other places do. There's a trace of presence here, not strong enough to name, but steady. You wonder if the shoe belonged to someone in the photo. It's unlikely. The time between them could span decades, but the mind has a way of wanting connections, of finding invisible threads between scattered pieces. The air stirs, just enough to move a loose scrap of paper across the tiles. It drifts toward the fountain, stopping against its base. You watch it for a moment, before leaning back on the bench, the wood pressing unevenly against your shoulders. This square, you think, might be the kind of place that anchors itself in memory without effort. Not because of anything grand, but because of its shape, its placement, its quiet. There's no single feature that demands your attention, yet the space holds you. It asks nothing but for you to notice it. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the air settle. The faint scent of stone and dust is joined by something else, a trace of old wood, maybe from the bench beneath you. The sound here isn't absence, not entirely. It's a low, steady hum, like the breath of a room that hasn't been entered for a long time. When you open your eyes again, the square looks unchanged. The shoe still rests by the fountain. The paper still lies against its base. The streets still stretch outward like quiet paths to other places you may never see. You think about staying here for a while, not out of fatigue, but because leaving feels like cutting short a conversation. You don't know what the square would say if it could speak, but you suspect it would not use many words. For now, that's enough. If you've been enjoying the story so far, remember, you can subscribe to Quilloren Radio to hear more tales like this one each night. It helps keep these quiet journeys coming your way. Now, let's return to where we left off and step back into the ruins you've been walking through. You sit for a moment on a bent metal beam, the sun at a lazy slant over the ruins, shadows stretching long and uneven. The air is still warm, but not in the way it once was, not the easy, bustling warmth of a street market or a crowded park, but the kind that feels like the world is resting between breaths. It's here, with your hands resting on the cold beam, that your mind does what it sometimes does in quiet places. It begins walking backward. Not in sharp leaps or dramatic revelations, but in slow, cautious steps, as though memory itself doesn't want to disturb the dust. You think about the paths you didn't take. Not the big, cinematic ones with grand consequences, but the tiny, nearly invisible choices. The kind you can almost pretend wouldn't have mattered, until you admit they would have, in ways you'll never measure. You think about the time, years ago, when you almost signed up for a ceramics class. You passed by the sign-up table every day for a week, glancing at the display of handmade mugs and bowls. They weren't flawless. Some were lopsided, a little wobbly at the base. But there was a charm in their imperfection, in knowing someone had made them with their own hands. You still don't know why you didn't join. Maybe you thought you were too busy. Maybe you told yourself there'd be time later. Later never came, and now, holding a bent piece of rebar in a city that's more grass than concrete, you wonder if you'd have been any good at shaping clay. Your gaze drifts toward a collapsed building with vines curling through its windows. You picture, for no reason at all, yourself standing there years ago, stringing up wind chimes in a breeze that doesn't exist anymore. In this imagined past, you make them from bits of metal and glass, letting them catch the sun and sing in the wind. It's not something you ever seriously planned to do, just one of those vague, someday ideas you filed away. But now, the thought of the chimes feels oddly vivid, as if they might have been real. Some wishes were stranger still. There was that week where you convinced yourself you'd buy a typewriter. Not for work, not for letters, not for anything practical, just to hear the sound of the keys and feel the rhythm in your fingertips. You even spent evenings browsing photos of them online, deciding whether you liked the olive green model or the one with round cream keys. You told yourself you'd pick one up the next month. That was 3 years before the quiet came, before the streets emptied. Now, the thought of lugging a typewriter through the ruins makes you smirk. Heavy, impractical, and completely useless. Exactly the kind of thing that would have made you happy for no reason at all. Your mind drifts further, to dreams you never spoke aloud. You once wanted to keep bees. Not for honey, not really, but because you liked the idea of caring for something small and intricate. You imagined standing in a field with a low hum surrounding you, wearing one of those ridiculous mesh hats, moving slowly so they wouldn't mind you being there. The thought makes you chuckle now. The idea of a bee colony surviving here is absurd, but it's still nice to imagine the hum cutting through the silence. The ruins have a way of making these what-ifs feel closer than they are. Maybe it's because the buildings themselves are what-ifs, shells of what they used to be, shaped by time into something else entirely. You look at a wall with peeling paint and think about how it could have been restored instead of abandoned. You see a shattered storefront and wonder what it would look like if someone had kept it running. You think about your own choices the same way, what they might have looked like if you'd kept going. One memory surfaces that's almost embarrassing in its smallness. Years ago, you found a recipe for a ridiculous, overcomplicated dessert, the kind with layers of sponge and custard and fruit that takes hours to make. You bookmarked it, convinced you'd try it one day. You never did. It's not like you regret not eating it. You regret not having the moment of making it, not standing in your kitchen at midnight trying to balance cake layers while muttering to yourself. In its absence, the imagined scene feels almost like a lost possession. You shift your weight on the beam, and it groans under you. The sound pulls you back, just slightly, into the present. Dust drifts lazily through a shaft of light, and you follow it with your eyes, wondering how many particles you're actually seeing and how many your brain is just filling in. You think about the skills you never picked up. You never learned to sew beyond the most basic, desperate repairs. You never learned to whistle properly. Your attempts always ended in an airy hiss that made people laugh. You never learned to draw more than lopsided stars and uneven cubes. None of these would have saved the world or changed your life, but their absence is a quiet, persistent gap. A funny kind of gap, too, because you're certain that somewhere out there, in a world that used to be, someone made a perfectly tailored shirt, whistled a whole tune, and drew a flawless cube, and probably thought nothing of it. These thoughts aren't heavy. They don't hurt. They pass through like clouds, shifting, shading the ground for a moment, then moving on. You can almost see them collecting above you, this drifting collection of could-have-beens. The beam beneath you is cold now, the sun slipping behind taller ruins. A breeze stirs, faint but enough to make the vines shiver against the walls. You close your eyes for a moment, and in the darkness behind them, the what-ifs arrange themselves into little scenes, not regrets, but alternate rooms you could have walked into. You know you'll never visit them, but it's strangely comforting to know they exist, even if only in imagination. You open your eyes again and stand, brushing dust from your palms. The ruins stretch out ahead, and the beam behind you stays where it is, holding the echo of your pause. You take a slow step forward, the thought lingering that in another life, in another set of choices, you might have been doing something else entirely, but you're here now, in this quiet, walking through what remains. You find it half buried beneath a tangle of dry grass and fractured stone, a rusted metal box, no bigger than a loaf of bread. Its lid is dented, one corner eaten away by years of damp and neglect. You don't recognize it at first as anything important. It could easily be mistaken for a forgotten lunchbox, or maybe an old toolbox that someone dropped and never came back for. But the moment you crouch beside it, you know it's neither. It's heavier than it looks when you lift it. The weight has a certain fullness, the kind that says there's something inside that shouldn't be. You sit cross-legged in the dirt, brushing the dry soil from the top with your sleeve. The rust has bloomed in uneven patches, and when you press your fingers to it, they come away with a faint reddish stain. The latch is stubborn. You pry it with a thin piece of scrap metal until it snaps free with a sound that feels too loud for the quiet around you. The lid creaks as it opens, and you find yourself looking at a strange collection of things, carefully arranged and surprisingly intact. The first is a folded sheet of paper, yellowed and brittle. You unfold it slowly and see a list written in neat handwriting. It isn't a shopping list or a set of instructions. It's a catalog of moments. Each line is a single sentence, describing something small. The first frost that year made the grass glitter like sugar. We sat on the roof and counted satellites until our necks ached. You wore the scarf I knitted, even though it was uneven. The handwriting tilts slightly to the right, confident but unpretentious. Whoever wrote this wasn't trying to impress anyone. Beneath the paper is a small tin of pressed flowers, each one still holding a faint trace of color. There's a sprig of lavender, its scent long gone but its shape unmistakable. A daisy, its petals fragile and curling inward. A pressed leaf, its veins like a tiny map. You can't help but think about how someone took the time to flatten and preserve them, knowing they'd lose their life but keep their form. Next is a cassette tape, the kind that hasn't been useful in years. There's no player here, no way to know what's on it. But the label, written in the same tidy script as the list, simply says, Voices, October. You imagine the click of the play button, the faint hiss of tape, and then the sound of someone speaking, maybe laughing, maybe telling a story, maybe saying nothing important at all. You find a photograph near the bottom of the box, its edges curled. It shows two people standing on a hill, their faces half lit by the setting sun. They're not posing. One is mid-sentence, mouth slightly open, hand gesturing. The other is looking away at something out of frame. The background is wide open, the kind of view that makes the air feel endless. There's no note on the back, no clue as to who they are or where they were. The last object is a key. It's small, brass, and worn smooth, tied to a frayed bit of blue ribbon. It could open a lock that no longer exists, or it could be purely symbolic. You hold it in your palm for a long moment, feeling its slight curve, wondering if it once fit a door, a box, a diary. You arrange everything on the ground beside you, the list, the flowers, the cassette, the photograph, the key. It feels wrong to call them possessions. They're more like anchors, points in time held still by care and intention. Someone buried them, knowing they'd be found, though maybe not by you. Your mind drifts to the person who assembled this capsule. Were they trying to preserve their own memories or pass something along? Did they imagine a future where someone like you would open it in the middle of a place that's nearly silent? Did they hope these things would outlast them? Or was it enough just to put them away? You read the list again, slowly, savoring each line. None of them are extraordinary. There's no mention of grand events, no declarations of love or sorrow. Just small, ordinary moments, the kind you don't notice until you're looking back. You realize that in their own quiet way, these moments are more permanent than anything else in the box. The sun shifts, casting a brighter patch across the flowers. For a moment, you imagine putting everything back, sealing the box, and hiding it again, leaving it for someone else to find years from now. But that feels dishonest. The box was meant to be opened. These things were meant to be touched, seen, remembered, even by strangers. You decide instead to carry them for a while. Not all of them. The flowers are too fragile, and the paper too delicate to survive travel. You fold the list carefully and slip it into your jacket pocket. The key you tie to your bag strap, where it dangles with a faint metallic tap when you move. The photograph you keep flat between two pieces of cardboard. The cassette you leave in the box. You know you'll never hear what's on it, and there's something oddly fitting about that. Let the voices stay locked in their own October, wherever and whenever that was. You place the box, now lighter, in the crook of a fallen wall. The wind stirs, brushing against the exposed contents with a faint rustle. You take one last look before you stand, and for a second you imagine the person who buried it, standing here long before you, pressing the soil down with both hands. As you walk away, the key taps softly against your bag. The sound follows you through the ruins, a reminder of something you'll never fully understand, but will carry anyway. The path ahead curves toward a stretch of buildings you haven't explored yet. You think about how many other boxes might be out there, how many other lists and photographs and bits of ribbon are waiting. It makes the silence feel less empty. You don't know if you'll ever find another capsule, but you know you'll keep looking, not just for boxes, but for anything that feels like a message sent forward in time. And as you walk, the wind at your back, you find yourself quietly adding to the list in your pocket, in your own handwriting this time. You write about the way the vines caught the light on the walls today, about the sound of the key tapping against your bag, about the moment you found a box and opened it, knowing you were holding someone else's moments in your hands. You pause on the cracked pavement of what was once a wide boulevard, the ruins stretching outward in every direction like a frozen map of forgotten lives. The air is cooler here, carrying the faint scent of metal and something else, the faint sweetness of overripe fruit that has long since fallen from trees no longer standing. A breeze stirs, moving lazily through broken windows and the hollow skeletons of buildings, and it feels almost conspiratorial, as though the wind itself is willing you to look farther, to imagine beyond the decay immediately around you. You tilt your head and glance along the tops of collapsed structures. In the distance, a cluster of steel frameworks rises jagged against the sky, their shapes unfamiliar enough to make you wonder what they will become, if anything, in the centuries to come. You think about what the city might look like far ahead, in a time when the streets you now walk are remembered only in fragments. Will anyone stand where you stand now, scanning the horizon, tracing the same ruined silhouettes with quiet curiosity? Or will these remnants have crumbled to dust, leaving only the echo of their existence in stories passed down by someone who remembers them in fragments too small to form a full picture? It is impossible to answer, and yet you linger, letting the question settle into the bones of your observation. Perhaps a future scavenger will pass here, long after your own footprints have been erased, and stumble upon some relic, a bent piece of metal, a broken bottle, a photograph with edges curled and fading. Perhaps they, too, will wonder who walked before them, what they carried, and why it mattered at all. You imagine the small satisfaction they might feel in discovering something that connects them to a life long gone, even if that life was ordinary, even if it was nothing like a legend. You step carefully over a length of broken railing, noting how the shadow it casts stretches like an uneven ribbon across the cracked road. For a moment, your mind drifts further, imagining the machinery that might replace the simple tools you know now. Perhaps someone will stand where you do, hands hovering over panels and levers you cannot identify. Perhaps they will laugh quietly at the inefficiency of old locks, old latches, old ways of doing things that seemed practical in their time. You picture a future where the chair you once rested upon is considered an artifact, a primitive seat that creaked in protest at every shift of weight. The sun shifts lower, illuminating fragments of the street with an amber glow. You notice a section of wall with remnants of painted letters, only partially legible now. They might have been an advertisement or a warning once, but now they read as shapes, abstract and poetic. You trace them with your eyes, and imagine how they will appear centuries from now, as the paint flakes away further and nature reclaims the surface. The idea is comforting. Time both erases and preserves, leaving traces for those who come later to interpret as they can. Your thoughts turn to the families who might have lived here before the silence took over. Houses that once hummed with conversation, the shuffle of feet, the clatter of dishes, all now empty, shadows folded into the corners. You picture a future observer stepping carefully through the ruins, picking up the faint scent of old meals, the rough texture of walls touched by generations. They will see the marks of lives lived without knowing the full story, the same way you do now. Perhaps they will note the humor in a crooked nail or a wall scuffed in a pattern that made sense only to its original inhabitant. The city itself is a narrative, even when no one is telling it aloud. Your gaze drifts upward to the tops of the skeletal buildings. You imagine the wind carrying small pieces of paper, fragments of lists or letters, up and out into the atmosphere, scattering across a future that will never read them. Perhaps someone will find these fragments centuries from now, piecing together tiny glimpses of lives that once existed. The thought is oddly satisfying, that even in abandonment, even in quiet decay, there is potential for connection, however faint. You consider the simple acts that might survive alongside the ruins: a jar left on a windowsill, a key wedged into a lock that no longer works, a photograph tucked into a drawer that has long since fallen open. Future visitors might encounter these objects, pausing to wonder about their owners. The pause itself is a kind of preservation. You can almost feel the hands of those future visitors, careful, reverent, quietly amused by details that make no sense to them but were once ordinary. Perhaps they will notice the slight tilt of a picture frame, or the way sunlight fell across a table in a room now long gone. The boulevard stretches endlessly, but your attention narrows to a single patch of light reflected on broken glass. It catches your eye, bright and small, and you bend down to examine it. The fragments form a jagged mosaic that glimmers as you shift your perspective. For a moment, you imagine a person decades from now, kneeling in exactly this way, fascinated by the same glimmer, tracing it with a fingertip, wondering about the hands that once set the glass here. The parallel is comforting, a quiet reassurance that time may scatter everything, but patterns of curiosity endure. You notice how small sounds travel differently now: the distant rustle of debris, a faint drip of water somewhere inside a building, the wind brushing against metal that still holds together. You imagine a future in which someone stands here, listening to these same sounds, wondering how long it has taken them to reach this quiet. Perhaps they, too, will feel the same mixture of awe and amusement, noticing a small, inconsequential quirk in the ruins, like a door that squeaks or a brick that juts outward, and smiling softly to themselves. Your thoughts drift again, this time toward the broader expanse of the city beyond the boulevard. The ruins may eventually be overtaken entirely, streets swallowed by grass, buildings softened by erosion, the memories of everyday life reduced to scattered traces. Yet even then, fragments will remain. A patch of patterned stone, a rusted hinge, a key long detached from any lock. Perhaps someone will stumble across it, unearthing it without context, and quietly imagine the world that once existed. The moment of imagination becomes a small bridge across centuries. You think about the permanence of objects versus the impermanence of the people who handled them. The key you carry in your bag, the list you tucked away in your pocket, the photograph of someone whose expression you will never know, all of these have survived in ways you could never have expected. The people who once held them are gone, but their traces linger, waiting for others to notice, to consider, to connect, even briefly. It is both a small miracle and a gentle reminder of your own place in this continuum. The shadows grow longer as the sun dips lower. You take a slow step forward, watching how the light changes, how the ruins themselves seem to bend toward it. The outlines of buildings become softened, almost forgiving, as though the city itself understands the passage of time and the inevitability of its own decline. You imagine the future observer arriving at this very street, seeing only softened edges, broken glass, and the faint glimmer of sunlight on a shard, and perhaps feeling exactly what you feel now, a sense of continuity, of quiet connection across time. You pause at a corner where the road curves out of sight. The ruins beyond are indistinct, but you can picture them clearly. Walls crumbling, doors swinging on rusted hinges, staircases leading to nowhere. You imagine someone centuries from now stepping carefully over these same stones, tracing paths that you have just walked. Perhaps they will smile at the same misaligned brick, or wonder why the metal railing is bent in that one peculiar way. The small, ordinary details endure almost stubbornly in the face of centuries. You breathe slowly, letting the quiet settle around you. In the distance, a bird, or what remains of a bird, flits across the horizon, its shadow fleeting over the cracked pavement. You consider the improbability of all these continuities, objects surviving, impressions persisting, thoughts echoing across time. It is an odd, gentle comfort, knowing that you are both witness and participant, your presence now another layer in the city's quiet archive. As you move forward, you carry the awareness that these ruins will outlast you in ways you cannot predict. Future visitors, if any arrive, will encounter fragments of lives once lived, just as you have. They will observe, wonder, and perhaps smile softly at the absurdity of it all. A tilted picture, a rusted key, a tiny fragment of paper clinging to relevance long after the world has shifted. And though you do not know when or if this will happen, the knowledge that possibility exists is quietly sustaining. Each step you take feels deliberate, measured, aware of both the present and the future. The air carries the faint metallic tang, the distant scent of overripe fruit, the weight of sun-warmed stone underfoot. You are aware of the continuity of everything, from the dust stirred beneath your boots to the glint of light on broken glass. The ruins are not simply remnants of what is past. They are a bridge to what may come, a network of echoes waiting to be noticed again. And so you walk, not hurriedly, not with purpose beyond observation, but with the gentle attentiveness that the silence encourages. Every fragment, every glimmer, every faint sound becomes part of a larger tapestry, stitched across decades, centuries, maybe millennia. You feel both small and expansive at once, a single presence moving through a landscape that has outlasted its creators, yet carries their quiet fingerprints into a future you cannot fully imagine. You pause near a crumbling doorway, the edges of the stone softened by years of wind and rain, and let your thoughts wander. There is nothing urgent in these imaginings, no problem to solve, no future task demanding attention. The world is quiet, and so your mind drifts into small, improbable possibilities, the kind that exist only in the calm between one step and the next. A loose piece of metal glints faintly in the sunlight, and you imagine it humming softly, as if it has a secret song only you can hear. The sound is faint but pleasing, almost musical, though you know it cannot exist. You imagine the wind itself bending around certain objects just to avoid touching them, leaving certain corners untouched, as though the ruins had their own sense of etiquette. A fallen chair shifts imperceptibly under your gaze, settling in a perfect, upright position for reasons entirely unknown, as if it had been waiting for someone like you to notice it. You find yourself smiling at the thought, the absurdity of such tiny order within the chaos of abandonment. A patch of sunlight falls across a shattered window, and you think that perhaps the glass could shimmer in colors unseen by the human eye, projecting faint rainbows on the walls. You tilt your head slightly, imagining the spectrum dancing along the cracked pavement, each beam landing deliberately, like a private light show in a world abandoned. It is harmless, inconsequential, yet it holds your attention fully. The impossibility of it makes it sweeter. Your eyes fall on a stack of bricks piled against a collapsed wall. You picture them quietly, rearranging themselves when no one is watching, forming shapes and patterns that tell stories you will never fully understand. Perhaps a brick will lean slightly to one side to gesture toward a sunbeam, or a crack will widen just enough to let a sliver of light through a shadowed corner. Each minor movement is private, secret, and entirely unnecessary, yet entirely delightful in your imagination. A small bird alights on a rusted beam above your head. You imagine that it can speak, though only to you, in a language so quiet and subtle that no one else could ever perceive it. Perhaps it offers commentary on your walking pace, or remarks dryly on your curiosity about scattered metal scraps. You consider what it might say if it were capable of gentle, understated humor, the kind that draws a smile rather than laughter. You lean back, listening to the silence, and convince yourself that the bird is indeed watching and understanding, even if no sound reaches your ears. You spot a puddle in the uneven pavement, reflecting the sky in fractured pieces. You imagine that stepping into the puddle might momentarily transport you into a parallel version of the ruins, identical yet subtly different. In this imagined world, every detail is slightly more perfect. Windows intact, doors aligned, the air carrying the scent of a market that no longer exists. You almost step closer, considering the reflection carefully, and then remember that it is simply a puddle. Still, the fantasy lingers, warm and comforting, like a faint breeze on a quiet afternoon. A stray ribbon caught on a bent railing flutters gently in the wind. You picture it moving not at random, but with intention, as if performing a delicate, private dance. You imagine that it signals to other ribbons, forming a network of subtle communication entirely invisible to the unobservant eye. The thought is absurd, and you chuckle softly at yourself, the dry humor arising naturally from your own imaginings. The ribbon does not care. It flutters anyway, and you enjoy the idea that its small, purposeless movement is quietly meaningful in some secret, invisible way. You notice a loose brick that seems just a little higher than the others. You imagine that if you tapped it gently, it might reveal a miniature world inside, a tiny room furnished with impossibly small objects, inhabited by creatures who never leave, who live entirely in calm, quiet routines. The fantasy is impossible, of course, but it feels satisfying to hold it in your mind. You picture their mornings, their rituals, the faint hum of tiny appliances you cannot hear, all operating in perfect harmony. The impossibility of it is part of the pleasure. Your gaze drifts upward to the sky above the ruins. You imagine clouds forming slowly into shapes that persist far longer than they should, almost as if the sky itself were patient and observant. Perhaps a cloud pauses just above a particular building, casting shade intentionally, marking some invisible landmark in a world that no longer needs signs. Perhaps another drifts lazily, aligning with sunlight to create perfect, fleeting patterns on broken walls. These ideas are entirely fanciful, yet they make the quiet around you feel alive in a different way. You think about the objects you've touched, the key in your bag, the photograph tucked carefully under cardboard, the list in your pocket, and imagine them having small, secret lives of their own. Perhaps the key occasionally rattles when no one is near, almost as if testing its own potential. The photograph might shimmer faintly in sunlight, revealing the past in tiny, impossible motions that only you could ever perceive. The list, words slightly moving along the page as though trying to reorder themselves, silently debating which moment deserves prominence. Each object is mundane, yet the imagination assigns it subtle vitality, quiet personality. You wander further, feeling the ruins settle around you like a soft blanket. A fragment of a broken sign juts upward, and you imagine it as a miniature flagpole, waving something delicate and invisible. The movement is precise, calculated, and entirely ceremonial. Perhaps it is a signal for other fragments of debris, an unspoken communication across the quiet expanse. You smile at the idea, amused by the improbable choreography of a world you cannot see but can imagine fully. A shard of glass catches your eye, thin and translucent, lying half buried in dust. You imagine that if you peer closely enough, you could glimpse not your own reflection, but a version of the ruins unchanged, a quiet, stable timeline preserved perfectly. The reflection is peaceful, absent of the wind, absent of sound, a world frozen in ideal stillness. You linger, letting the impossibility rest comfortably in your mind. The shard does not care, yet it holds your attention for longer than it has any right to. You notice a rusted hinge swinging slightly on its own. You imagine that it is opening and closing with intention, perhaps welcoming you to this impossible space, perhaps simply performing a private ritual of movement. There is no need for explanation. The hinge does not notice you noticing it, yet the shared observation becomes a small connection, quiet and enduring. You walk past it slowly, listening to the subtle click of metal against metal, aware that your mind has given it life it could not otherwise have. You consider the silence surrounding you, imagining it not as emptiness, but as a canvas. Perhaps whispers form there, tiny suggestions of lives long past, blending with wind and light and dust. Perhaps distant sounds resolve into soft, gentle laughter, faint and fleeting. Your imagination allows these impossibilities to feel entirely real, a private indulgence without consequence. The world outside the ruins continues elsewhere, but here your fantasies exist, sustained only by observation and gentle intention. The sun dips lower, the shadows lengthening, and you imagine the ruins themselves breathing, very slowly, subtly. The buildings contract and expand imperceptibly, as though taking careful note of your passage. Perhaps cracks shift slightly to accommodate your footsteps. Perhaps fallen tiles rearrange ever so slightly, settling into quieter patterns. None of this could happen in reality, and yet the fantasy is comforting. It is a quiet exercise of awareness and presence, allowing you to interact with the world in a gentle, impossible way. Finally, as you pause on a stretch of broken pavement, you picture the ruins shifting entirely out of view, reassembling themselves into new shapes that exist only for you to witness. Walls align differently, light falls in new patterns. The wind seems to hum a note it has never carried before. You walk through this imagined version of the city carefully, savoring its calm, its imperceptible movement, its quiet humor. The impossibility is its charm. Nothing needs to change. Nothing is lost. Everything is just slightly different in a way that only your mind perceives. You sit down finally on a fragment of stone, letting your thoughts linger in the improbable possibilities. There is no urgency. Nothing must happen. The key taps softly against your bag. The list rests in your pocket, the photograph under cardboard. And for a long while, The ruins around you exist not only in reality, but in every gentle, improbable possibility your imagination allows, each one private, harmless, and fleeting. The sunlight fades slowly, the shadows folding into one another. You rise, brushing dust from your pants, feeling a quiet satisfaction in the time spent wandering not only through the ruins, but through these harmless, improbable, private fantasies. The world is as it is, yet in your mind, it dances with imperceptible movement, whispering possibilities that exist nowhere but here, and you carry them gently with you. You settle on a broad, flat fragment of stone, the edges softened by years of erosion, and allow your body to sink into stillness. Every muscle eases, the weight of movement dissolving, and your breathing becomes slow and deliberate. The air carries the faint metallic tang that has been present all along, mixed now with the soft, indistinct scent of sun-warmed dust. Your shoulders release the tension you hadn't realized you were holding, and the ruins themselves feel less like obstacles and more like companions, inert, patient, entirely accepting of your quiet presence. The light shifts imperceptibly, golden at the edges of collapsed buildings, fading gradually into muted shades of gray and amber. Dust motes drift lazily in shafts of sunlight, and you notice their slow, imperceptible paths. You follow them with your gaze for a long moment, tracing each movement as though it carries intention. Each one drifts in silence, unaware of your observation, yet you feel a strange kinship, a shared stillness that spans the divide between observer and object. Your hands rest lightly on the uneven stone beneath you, feeling the rough texture, the tiny ridges and grooves worn smooth over decades. The temperature is neither hot nor cold, merely constant, comforting in its neutrality. You let your fingers wander briefly, tracing patterns you did not intend, and find that the mind relaxes further. Each sensation, stone, air, dust, distant echoes of metal, becomes a subtle anchor, drawing you deeper into the present moment, allowing all thought of time and expectation to soften. The faint hum of the wind across broken structures forms a low, continuous note. It is steady, unremarkable, and yet entirely sufficient to occupy awareness. You notice the slight differences in how it passes over corrugated metal, over cracked glass, over the uneven pavement. Each sound is a small marker of reality, a soft punctuation in the vast silence. You let your hearing stretch, listening not to understand, but simply to witness. The world holds its breath, and so do you. Your gaze drifts across a pile of debris, noting the subtle textures of crumbled concrete, rusted metal, and splintered wood. No story needs to be told here. The fragments exist, quiet and dignified in their abandonment. You observe their angles, the play of light and shadow across fractured surfaces, and recognize the calm repetition in their forms. There is no rush, no question of resolution, only the ongoing, unhurried reality of what is. You focus on the faint warmth of the sun where it brushes your forearms. It is neither insistent nor fleeting, merely present. You let the warmth sink in, feeling it spread slowly through your body, mingling with the calm awareness of air and dust, stone and shadow. The combination is soothing, grounding, a gentle reminder that existence in this moment requires nothing more than noticing, feeling, breathing. A distant scrape echoes faintly, perhaps a piece of metal shifting, perhaps a creature long unseen. You do not need to investigate. Instead, you let the sound pass through your awareness, accepting it without judgment or concern. It blends seamlessly with the other subtle noises, the soft whisper of wind, the faint shifting of dust, the occasional distant tinkle of something metallic carried by the breeze. Nothing demands action. Everything is simply present. Your breathing deepens, slow and steady. Each inhalation fills your lungs with the gentle stillness around you. Each exhalation releases tension you were not aware of holding. Thoughts drift past in soft, quiet waves, inconsequential and unremarkable. Names, memories, small observations, each floats by like a leaf in the wind, acknowledged and released without insistence. You notice this process itself, the subtle ebb and flow of awareness, and allow it to carry you further into calm. The stone beneath you is firm yet forgiving. You feel its weight supporting you fully, every uneven contour aligning with your body without resistance. The texture is familiar now, and you trace it again lightly with your fingers, noting its irregularities, its small, quiet imperfections. There is no need to catalog or remember them. Simply observing is enough. Each touch reinforces the sense of grounding, the knowledge that you are present, entirely, in this space and moment. The shadows lengthen, folding softly across the ruins. Shapes that seemed distinct earlier now blur gently, edges dissolving into one another. A broken wall no longer appears as jagged, but as a subtle gradient of light and shadow softening into the ambient quiet. You notice this shift, and accept it without resistance, letting your vision rest comfortably on softened lines, muted contrasts, a world gently blurring at the edges. You listen to the interplay of textures in the air, the faint roughness of stone, the grain of broken wood, the subtle vibration of metal responding to wind. The small differences are more than sensory. They are punctuation in the ongoing stillness. Each detail matters because it exists, not because it requires action or meaning. You notice it fully, and the noticing itself becomes a gentle meditation, a continuous acknowledgement of life in its simplest forms. Your body relaxes further. Legs, arms, shoulders, neck, all soften, blending into the weight of stone and air. Breathing continues steadily, quietly, each cycle a reminder that there is no rush, no goal, no expectation beyond the present awareness. You feel the rhythm of stillness, slow and measured, echoing through every part of your body until the difference between you and the surroundings begins to blur. You notice again the drifting dust motes, the way light fragments across uneven surfaces, the faint hum of wind. Each small observation forms a lattice of calm awareness. You trace it without effort, noting the interconnectedness of light, shadow, texture, and sound. Each moment is complete in itself, entire without expectation or narrative, quiet without insistence. The photograph you carry in your pocket, the key, the small list, all are near you but no longer occupy urgent thought. They exist quietly as part of the larger, encompassing stillness. You feel no need to examine or remember them. Their presence is simply another layer in the calm, unhurried space around you. You acknowledge them gently, releasing any attachment, allowing them to rest alongside the ruins themselves. The air cools slightly, the sun dipping lower, the shadows merging into one another. The ruins have softened, the textures indistinct, the sounds distant. You feel yourself blending into the ambient quiet, your perception stretching outward, encompassing stone, dust, air, and shadow. Each inhalation and exhalation matches the stillness, every breath a continuation of the calm presence around you. You notice the faint warmth of sunlight on your skin diminishing, replaced by the subtle coolness of fading day. The stone beneath you, the textures of broken surfaces, the gentle breeze, all these become part of the larger ongoing stillness, each element quietly reinforcing the other. You do not need to move. You do not need to act. You do not need to observe beyond what is immediately present. Everything is sufficient, exactly as it is. Your mind softens. Thoughts, memories, and quiet imaginings drift past lightly, acknowledged and released without insistence. The stillness around you and within you aligns, creating a continuous flow of awareness, gentle and unbroken. Time loses definition. Past and future dissolve into a simple, quiet presence. The ruins themselves fade softly into your peripheral vision, blending with shadows, dust, and light. The textures of stone, metal, and wood merge into a single tapestry of quiet sensation. You feel your presence, no longer separate from the space around you. You are the air, the stone, the drifting dust, the faint warmth of sunlight, the subtle hum of wind. Everything and nothing exist simultaneously, without distinction, without judgment, entirely calm. You breathe slowly, deeply, letting the rhythm of your body match the ambient stillness. Every sound, every texture, every subtle movement in the ruins forms a single, unified presence. There is no goal, no narrative, no expectation. There is only the quiet, the calm, the soft continuity of the environment and your awareness within it. Movement ceases entirely. Breath continues only as a quiet rhythm, body fully relaxed, mind fully softened. Every detail, stone, air, shadow, light, merges into a gentle, undifferentiated whole. There is no self apart from the surrounding stillness. No action is required. No observation remains necessary. Only the ambient presence exists, complete, sufficient, and infinite in its quiet simplicity. The story does not end. It does not conclude. It simply stops being told. The ruins, the dust, the air, the light, the faint warmth, and the slow rhythm of breath all remain, undisturbed, continuing without demand or expectation. You, entirely still, are a part of the space, indistinguishable, blended, and calm. All is quiet. All is soft. All is present.